If we hear about that governance change or systems are being dealt with, often a conversation that arises is, people from the private sector should just take over and come in because there's efficiency that comes with that. But we also know that the private sector, as we've seen in the headlines in the recent weeks, can sometimes be the cause for governance challenges in our country if we're looking at the manipulation of the rand and currencies and the like. So just tell me, how do the private and public sector work better together, and is there someone going to rescue us from there?
Thanks very much, Nzinga. Roger and fellow panelists, glad to be with you. I think because we have so many multiple intersecting crises, and because the private sector is seen as this island of efficiency, our first move is to stem the bleeding by turning to the private sector. And in some ways, I think that is a reasonable short-term solution. If there's no capacity in the state in Transnet or in Eskom, we rush to the private sector, at least import that capacity into the state and stop the immediate crisis. But I think we need to think long and hard about what that could mean for our democracy, because in the long term, the democratic accountability that is supposed to exist between citizens and the government gets eroded when the private sector starts playing an increasing role in the functions of the state. And so our capacity as citizens to hold government accountable becomes undermined by an increased role of the private in the state. And so I'm worried that in the short term, an increased role for the private sector in our state. It's almost as if rather than state participation in the economy, we now have business participation in the state. And we need to think long and hard about the long-term consequences of that. Ultimately, it's about building a state that doesn't need to rest and lean on the private sector. Mm-hmm. And I think we probably have to have a transition period where once we've stabilized our multiple crises, our first port of call is restabilizing the state and regenerating that direct link between citizens and the government.
Mm-hmm. Coral, we know that if we're going to have a well-functioning state, it also goes down to well-functioning cities. They're a major conduit for growth in a country. How do we get our cities and metros back to performing at those required levels that we need and becoming those engines of growth that were envisaged in 1994?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I was thinking about, as you were asking some of the panelists earlier, what they think the biggest crises are that are facing South Africa, and I certainly agree with all the issues that have been raised so far. The one that's particularly close to my heart is the spatial form of our cities and the way in which that the spatial legacy of apartheid, almost 30 years into the new South Africa, is still fundamentally undermining our society's ability to move forward and really get on with it. There's so many ways in which this problem manifests, but I was just recently reading some research that Treasury had published actually about labour market failure in South Africa, and specifically insofar as it relates to youth unemployment. And we as a society really stand out in the world in terms of our youth unemployment. Like, it is a very unusually high amount of youth unemployment. You could go to countries that are far less developed than South Africa across the continent, but you'll find that way more young people work than practically, whether it be in a formal or formal capacity, but they are doing something. This work that Treasury had done shows quite robustly how the spatial form of our cities, and basically, to put it bluntly, the fact that low wage and typically previously disadvantaged individuals are so far away from everything, because that's where we build RDP housing and state subsidized housing, is essentially making it impossible for those people to afford to look for work. It's that simple, right? If you live at the back end of Orange Farm, which is, we're sitting somewhere fairly central in Joburg right now, that's probably a 45-minute commute from here when there's no traffic, hour and 20-minute commute, early in the morning when you're on your way to work. So and that's if you can afford it in the first place, right? South Africans spend a third of their disposable income on transport, which is something we get nothing for. It's a pure cost. So, I could keep going and link this spatial challenge that we have in the way in which our cities have been developed in South Africa in the last 3 years, and obviously stemming from a long history of spatial segregation prior to that, and link that back to almost any developmental challenge that you can think of. Take early childhood development as an example. A child growing up in a household where their parents need to leave for work before they even get up in the morning and get home late at night after they've probably come home from school and and gone to bed, will have very different educational outcomes to a child whose parents can be present in their life, right? Because they live close to where the kid goes to school and where they work. Similar with everything from gender-based violence to primary healthcare outcomes. All of these issues that we see symptomatically in our society somehow are drawn back to the spatial fabric of our cities and the way in which they have been through decades of spatial policy unfortunately been sprawled in this manner. So I don't want to say that is the challenge facing our cities, but it's certainly the one that I'm very passionate about and working on, and our business is one of these private sector institutions that are stepping into a void where government is presently failing to provide the necessary services by providing well-located, affordable accommodation to specifically these households. But I guess our hope as a business is that in time, through doing what we do, we can inspire government to join us and really ultimately take over from us in developing housing for low-wage members of our society in a manner that is more befitting, I think, of the kind of society that we want to create.
So Ngoma, as we look at growth and what we're hoping to achieve in getting back to some of that excitement and that potential that we saw in 1994, we also need to look at the risks to South Africa. The World Bank released a report saying basically that crime costs South Africa about 10% of GDP. And so that's such a massive risk to us growing. How do you deal with something that's so almost entrenched in the fabric of who we are as South Africans and how we live?
Yeah, I mean, similar to what Roger said right at the beginning, there's so many issues, right? You can latch on crime, you can latch on unemployment, and I think in a lot of the challenges we face as a country, we're often kind of solving for the symptoms rather than kind of understanding what the root cause issues are. And I think the crime and like GBV are some of those where you can do stuff to solve for the symptom, but if you have not truly understood what the root cause is, and for me personally, I find that we have eroded like dignity for so many people in this country that there is a prevailing storm of people who do not have self-dignity, do not have self-agency, and are fundamentally victims of whatever the system is. And I truly believe that for me, one of the key factors we've got to get right is around how to reinstate that dignity, how to actually give people a sense of agency over their own lives and being able to actually play a role in what their lives become. Carl just mentioned now about the high rate of youth unemployment. I think like unemployment and youth unemployment specifically is beyond a ticking time bomb. And I think when we talk about crime and we talk about many other challenges and our lack of growth and our lack of stability, a lot of it stems from those type of root cause issues around if we have an inability to appropriately educate people, an inability to provide people human dignity, and an inability to provide people agency over their own ability to be economically active in their own country, where they actually feel like third-class citizens, then we will see many symptoms, crime being some of those, GBV being some of those. And I really think that it's not about getting back to the previous excitement. I think there's a new, renewed excitement that we need to create rather than it is about trying to get back to 94, but about understanding right now as we look at 2024, what is the excitement we need for 2024? Because I think it's fundamentally different that is required next year rather than what was required in 94.
I love that. Roger, you've heard so many views about the challenges that there are, the excitement that there is, the potential that's there as well. How do you even start to deal with that from a leadership point of view if you're a person who wants to be part of resetting South Africa and coming back and bringing some of the dignity that's been spoken about, the excitement, the potential, and harnessing all of that?
Yeah, look, I think you're right. This notion of just listening, I think people are tired of that, right? And the flip side of that is, isn't it really about accountability ultimately? Because the stock response from a voter or a young person in particular is there's a cycle. Okay, people tend to listen more intently the closer the election is. And then it goes away and everyone says, so what, right, Malik? So I think listening and accountability are sort of the twin challenges for somebody who wants to lead a society. Now, the way I would approach it is, if you look at the structure of the way we fulfill the dreams and hopes of people, right? We have an executive, which is the government. We have a parliament, and then we have citizenry. And it's not a complete unbroken line in between election cycles, but we're forced into that kind of dynamic, which is why it takes us to the point that you raised about the private sector having to step in, right?
Sure.
I know that the public sector is not the private sector, right? It's not. The truth of the matter is, because of the way this country has been mismanaged, there's a huge gap in the public sector. And so the palliative intervention of the private sector should not be taken for a long-term thing, okay? But ultimately, and I think you were referring to this, Carol, the issue is, can we restructure the way we do things in our country on a firm basis of social solidarity, right? So we all know there are extremely wealthy people and extremely poor people in our society. And how do we, as South Africans, lend a hand to rebuild this country? I don't think we want the nostalgia of 1994. It's 2024 next year, the world has changed, right? Where I think this intergenerational thing can really, this intergenerational movement can be a force for good, is that period embodied certain values about the society we want to be. We are not that society today, right? And culture and values resides in us. It doesn't reside in documents and emails and posters. We live the values and the culture. And so I think for veterans and people like myself who threw stones and waged wars with police and soldiers in the street, this is not the contract that we made, right? But we are here today. So how do we get back on track? And I think this thing of dignity, right? It's at the heart of everything. You go to a hospital, there's a nurse who has struggled all night to save a patient. He or she does not have what they need, okay? It's not rocket science, okay? And the way citizens engage with the state has to change. So I think together we have to fix the state, because the public sector will never play that role. Public sector can provide some palliative care, but the state has to fulfill its constitutional duty, which is clearly set out. And I will be talking a lot about social solidarity into the future, because this crisis moment doesn't demand ideology. It demands practical interventions so that we can deal with the dignity of people. You know, no one's grandmother should sit in the sun waiting for a pension payout, right? No one in 2023 should be drinking water that's riddled with cholera. No child should buy a biscuit and die because the food quality office has been destroyed in a municipality. So how do we join those dots? And that's why I still think the biggest challenge for us is to get like-minded people together in business, in civil society, and the public sector to solve these issues. And there are many issues, but I do think we have to start somewhere.